Napoleon Bonaparte's rise from a Corsican military officer to Emperor of the French is one of the most extraordinary stories in world history. His meteoric ascent did not happen in isolation, but was a direct consequence of the broader political, social, and economic changes that were sweeping across Europe during the late 18th century. At the heart of these transformations was the French Revolution, a period of radical upheaval that not only dismantled the centuries-old monarchy in France, but also brought to the forefront new ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The French Revolution became the breeding ground for Napoleon's ambitions, shaping both his character and his military genius, setting the stage for the Napoleonic Wars. Welcome to the War Vault. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was not just a political event. It was a social and ideological earthquake that would reshape the entire structure of France and, by extension, Europe. In France, the traditional social hierarchy, dominated by a monarchy, clergy, and nobility, was overthrown. The revolution's radical ideas spread quickly across the continent, inspiring similar movements in other nations. The revolution's core principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity posed a direct threat to the monarchies and aristocracies of Europe, and in response, coalitions of monarchs formed to crush this dangerous new force. For France, the revolution brought both opportunity and chaos. The revolutionary government was fragmented, and France found itself in a state of constant war with various coalitions of European monarchies. The country's economic system was in ruins, and France's influence abroad was in jeopardy. Amidst this turmoil, the revolutionaries needed strong leadership, and they found it in the form of Napoleon Bonaparte. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, Napoleon was the son of a minor noble family. His early education at military schools in mainland France introduced him to the world of strategy and warfare, a field in which he would soon excel. He was commissioned as an officer in the French army at a young age and quickly rose through the ranks, aided by his talents and the upheaval caused by the revolution. Napoleon's rise was accelerated by the revolution's rejection of traditional hierarchies, allowing talented individuals like him to gain prominence despite their relatively humble origins. Napoleon's early military career was marked by a series of swift and decisive victories, particularly in Italy. His success in Italy against the Austrians not only cemented his reputation as a military genius, but also made him one of the most popular figures in France. At just 26 years old, Napoleon was appointed as the commander of the French army in Italy. His campaign, which took place between 1796 and 1797, was characterized by rapid maneuvering, the strategic use of artillery, and the ability to outwit and outfight larger, more established enemy forces. The rise to power, from general to first consul. In 1799, the French Revolution entered a new phase. The country was reeling from the effects of prolonged warfare, political instability, and economic hardship. The revolution's ideals were being undermined by factions within the government, and France's position on the world stage was weak. Napoleon, now a successful and popular general, recognized an opportunity to capitalize on this instability. In November 1799, Napoleon executed a coup d'etat, overthrowing the ineffective and corrupt Directory, the governing body of France at the time. He established the consulate, with himself as first consul, effectively giving him control over the entire of the French government. This marked the beginning of Napoleon's political dominance. His rise to power was facilitated by his military success and the chaos that had enveloped France, as well as his ability to navigate the volatile political landscape. By 1802, Napoleon was named First Consul for life, a move that essentially made him the dictator of France. But he wasn't content with just political control. He sought to consolidate his power and bring stability to France. He enacted a series of reforms, including the Napoleonic Code, which standardized laws across the country and promoted the ideals of the revolution, such as equality before the law and the abolition of feudal privileges. These reforms won him the support of various social groups, including the bourgeoisie, who benefited from the stability and order he provided. Despite his dictatorial control, Napoleon maintained the appearance of republican ideals, using the guise of popular consent and national unity to legitimize his rule. This was particularly evident in 1804, when Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in a lavish ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. This act, though controversial, was an assertion of Napoleon's power and an attempt to secure the French throne for his family. The Napoleonic Wars, France against Europe. Napoleon's rise to power coincided with a period of unprecedented conflict in Europe. The wars of the French Revolution had been fought against coalitions of European monarchies, including Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. These monarchies saw the French Revolution as a threat to their own power and responded by forming coalitions to defeat France and restore the old order. When Napoleon took power, France was still engaged in war with these European powers. The French Revolutionary Wars were still ongoing, and Napoleon's objective was to secure France's borders and expand its influence across Europe. He knew that France's survival depended on its ability to maintain military dominance and defend against the coalitions of monarchies that sought to destroy it. Napoleon's military genius was immediately put to the test. He reorganized the French army, improving discipline and training while introducing new tactics that took advantage of the speed and mobility of the French forces. His ability to move his armies quickly and decisively became one of his trademarks. His victories at the battles of Marengo, 1800, and Austerlitz, 1805, showcased his ability to outmaneuver larger and more experienced enemy forces. At the Battle of Austerlitz, often considered one of Napoleon's greatest victories, he faced a combined army of Russian and Austrian forces. Despite being outnumbered, Napoleon used the terrain to his advantage, feigning weakness to lure the enemy into a vulnerable position, and then striking with devastating force. The result was a decisive victory that shattered the Third Coalition and solidified Napoleon's control over Central Europe, the continental system, and growing hostilities. As Napoleon consolidated power, he sought to implement policies that would both strengthen France and weaken his enemies. One of his most significant strategies was the continental system, a trade blockade designed to weaken Britain, which was France's most powerful adversary. The continental system forbade European nations from trading with Britain, hoping to cripple its economy and prevent it from using its naval power to control international trade. However, the continental system had mixed results. While it succeeded in disrupting British trade, it also caused economic hardship across Europe. Countries such as Spain and Russia were unwilling to fully comply with the blockade, and this created tensions between Napoleon and his allies. The tensions eventually boiled over, and in 1812, Napoleon faced his most disastrous military campaign yet, The invasion of Russia, the legacy of Napoleon's rise. Napoleon's rise to power was a combination of military brilliance, political maneuvering, and the volatile environment created by the French Revolution. His ability to navigate these challenges and transform himself from a military officer to the Emperor of the French is a testament to his exceptional ambition and drive. However, his rise was also indicative of the larger changes happening in Europe. The old monarchies were increasingly unable to resist the tide of revolutionary ideas, and Napoleon's empire, though built on military power, was an expression of these new ideologies. Napoleon's reign marked a fundamental shift in the political landscape of Europe. His spread of revolutionary ideals, coupled with his ability to centralize power and manage vast territories, would leave a lasting impact on European politics, warfare, and governance. The Napoleonic Wars would soon engulf all of Europe, setting the stage for the dramatic and brutal conflicts that would define the early 19th century. As Napoleon expanded his empire, Europe would find itself caught between the old order and the revolutionary ideals that Napoleon championed. The clash between these forces would form the core of the Napoleonic Wars, which would reshape the map of Europe and have consequences that rippled through history for generations. The early years of Napoleon Bonaparte's reign were marked by his exceptional military tactics and the rapid expansion of the French Empire. After securing his power in France, Napoleon's ambitions were set not just on preserving his nation's borders, but on creating a vast European empire under his control. Through a combination of military genius, diplomatic maneuvering, and an unmatched ability to motivate his army, Napoleon conquered much of Europe, from Spain in the west to Russia in the east, shaping the continent's political landscape for decades to come. Napoleon's military campaigns during the Napoleonic Wars were as much about strategy and timing as they were about sheer firepower. His tactical innovations, such as the use of highly mobile, well-coordinated corps, revolutionized warfare and left an indelible mark on military history. His victories against the coalitions of European monarchies, many of whom were more numerous and experienced, cemented his place as one of the greatest military commanders in history. The Continental System and early conflicts. The Napoleonic Wars were not just a series of military campaigns, but also political and economic struggles that involved complex diplomatic negotiations. Napoleon's most significant diplomatic initiative was the Continental System, which sought to isolate Britain from the rest of Europe by blocking its trade routes. In 1806, after Napoleon's victory at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, he set up the Continental System, which prohibited European countries from trading with Britain. This embargo was designed to cripple the British economy, which had long been the world's economic powerhouse, and force the British to negotiate with France. The Continental System was initially successful in disrupting British trade, but it was not without significant drawbacks. Countries like Spain and Russia, which were nominally part of Napoleon's empire, resisted the embargo, which created friction between Napoleon and his allies. Moreover, the system hurt the economies of European countries that were dependent on trade with Britain, leading to widespread resentment. As a result, Napoleon faced increasing unrest in his empire, and the Continental System ultimately failed to break Britain's economic dominance. The first major challenge to Napoleon's reign came in 1808 with the Peninsular War. Napoleon's decision to invade Spain in 1808 as part of his broader strategy to enforce the Continental System led to a protracted and bitter conflict. Napoleon placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, But this sparked a popular uprising that quickly spread throughout Spain. The Spanish were joined by British forces under the Duke of Wellington, and together they mounted a fierce resistance against the French invaders. The Peninsular War was a costly and bloody conflict for Napoleon. It drained French resources, slowed his military progress, and ultimately became a significant factor in his downfall. The war also marked the first major instance of popular resistance to Napoleon's rule, and it served as a powerful reminder that his empire was not invincible. Despite several victories, Napoleon could not subdue Spain, and his forces were forced into a costly guerrilla war that would last for years. Tactical brilliance on the battlefield. One of the defining characteristics of Napoleon's military campaigns was his ability to maneuver his forces in ways that disoriented and overwhelmed his enemies. His innovative tactics, including the use of combined arms and the flexible corps system, revolutionized warfare. Under Napoleon, the French army was divided into independent corps, each capable of operating autonomously, yet still being able to coordinate with other corps. This system allowed Napoleon to cover vast distances, concentrate forces at decisive points, and achieve battlefield superiority through rapid concentration and surprise. The Battle of Austerlitz, fought in 1805, remains one of Napoleon's most famous victories and a textbook example of his strategic brilliance. The battle took place in what is now the Czech Republic, and Napoleon faced a combined Russian and Austrian force that was numerically superior. However, Napoleon expertly lured the Allies into a vulnerable position. By feigning weakness and withdrawing from key positions, he tricked the Allies into thinking they had gained the upper hand. Once the Allies were fully committed to the attack, Napoleon unleashed his forces, rapidly concentrating them at critical points and surrounding the enemy with devastating effect. At Austerlitz, Napoleon's forces were heavily outnumbered, yet they decisively crushed the Allied armies, inflicting heavy casualties while suffering only moderate losses themselves. The battle was a triumph of both tactics and psychology. Napoleon was not only a brilliant strategist, but also a master of battlefield deception. The victory at Austerlitz solidified Napoleon's dominance in Europe, and the Treaty of Pressburg, which followed, resulted in Austria's withdrawal from the war and further territorial gains for France. But Austerlitz was just one example of Napoleon's tactical brilliance. His ability to move quickly and decisively was evident in many of his other victories, including the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, 1806, where he destroyed a Prussian army that had vastly outnumbered him, and the Battle of Friedland, 1807, where he decisively defeated a Russian army. The invasion of Russia, a fatal overextension. By 1812, Napoleon had successfully consolidated his empire across much of Europe. His control extended from Spain to Poland, with client states and allied monarchies under his influence. However, his grand ambition to dominate Europe led to one of the most disastrous military campaigns in history, the invasion of Russia. The conflict with Russia began when Tsar Alexander I refused to adhere to the continental system. Napoleon viewed this as a direct challenge to his authority, and in 1812 he launched an invasion of Russia with an army that numbered over 600,000 men, the largest military force ever assembled at the time. The Russian strategy was based on the scorched earth tactic, retreating further into the vastness of Russia while burning crops and villages to deny Napoleon's army the resources it needed. The early stages of the invasion were successful, with Napoleon's forces advancing rapidly through Russian territory capturing key cities like Smolensk. However, the Russian army refused to engage in a decisive battle, forcing Napoleon's troops deeper into the Russian interior. As the French army advanced, they encountered increasingly harsh conditions, with the Russian winter, lack of food, and constant skirmishes taking a heavy toll on their forces. In September 1812, the two armies finally met in a climactic confrontation at the Battle of Borodino, one of the bloodiest engagements of the Napoleonic Wars. The battle was indecisive, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Napoleon captured Moscow, but it was a hollow victory. The city had been abandoned by the Russians and set on fire, and Napoleon's troops found themselves without supplies, facing the brutal Russian winter. The retreat from Moscow was catastrophic for Napoleon's army. Harassed by Russian forces and decimated by the cold and starvation, the once mighty Grande Armée was reduced to a fraction of its original strength. By the time Napoleon finally withdrew from Russia in December 1812, fewer than 100,000 of his original 600,000 soldiers remained. The failure of the Russian campaign marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall. His enemies, emboldened by his defeat, began to rally against him, and the European coalitions that had previously been defeated now saw their opportunity. The turning tide, defeat, and the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon's disastrous campaign in Russia not only decimated his army, but also shattered his aura of invincibility. In 1813, the Sixth Coalition was formed, consisting of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, and Sweden. These nations, seeing the weakness of the French Empire, launched a series of coordinated attacks against Napoleon's forces. The Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, took place in October 1813 and was one of the most decisive engagements of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon, who had been forced to retreat from Russia, faced a combined army of over 300,000 soldiers. Despite his tactical brilliance, Napoleon could not overcome the sheer numerical superiority of the Allied forces. The battle ended in a catastrophic defeat for Napoleon, forcing him to retreat to France. Napoleon's empire was crumbling, and by early 1814, Allied forces had crossed into France. Paris was captured in March 1814, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate and exiled to the island of Elba. The legacy of Napoleon's military genius. Despite his eventual defeat, Napoleon's military genius remains undeniable. His tactical innovations, ability to inspire his troops, and mastery of battlefield deception have made him one of the greatest military commanders in history. His core system, emphasis on mobility, and combined arms approach were ahead of their time and set the standard for modern warfare. Even in defeat, Napoleon's influence on military strategy and tactics continued to be felt long after his exile. His legacy has influenced not only military commanders, but also political leaders throughout history, serving as both a cautionary tale and a model of ambition and resilience. Napoleon's wars reshaped Europe, and his impact on the continent would be felt for generations. Although he did not achieve his ultimate goal of creating a lasting French empire, his empire's collapse set the stage for the Congress of Vienna and the reorganization of Europe in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic era left a profound legacy on European politics, law, and warfare that endures to this day. The decline of Napoleon Bonaparte from his position as one of Europe's most powerful rulers to his eventual downfall is a tale of ambition, overreach, and a failure to adapt to the changing tides of history. While Napoleon's early military successes cemented his dominance across much of Europe, His refusal to stop expanding and his miscalculations led to catastrophic defeats that ultimately shattered his empire. The military genius who had once swept across the continent now faced coalitions of European powers who were united in their determination to defeat him. The final years of Napoleon's reign were marked by a series of defeats, political missteps, and ultimately his exile to the island of St. Helena, where he would spend the final years of his life. This period, from his disastrous Russian campaign in 1812 to his final abdication in 1815, stands as a reminder of how a once formidable ruler can be undone by the weight of his own ambition. The turning point in Napoleon's fortunes came with his ill-fated invasion of Russia in 1812. Despite having secured much of Europe under his control, Napoleon's ambitions led him to Russia, where Tsar Alexander I had openly defied his continental system. Napoleon's plan was to force Russia into submission by advancing on Moscow, but the campaign would turn out to be a fatal overreach. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, with over 600,000 soldiers from various allied nations. The vastness of Russia, the logistical challenges, and the resilience of the Russian people turned what should have been a relatively straightforward campaign into a disaster. As Napoleon marched deeper into Russian territory, the Russian army employed a scorched earth policy, retreating eastward while destroying anything that could be of use to Napoleon's advancing troops. This left the French army without supplies, and the soldiers began to suffer from starvation, disease, and the brutal Russian winter. The Battle of Borodino in September 1812, one of the bloodiest engagements of the Napoleonic Wars, saw the French army capture Moscow, but it was a hollow victory. The Russians had already abandoned the city, and by the time Napoleon's forces entered it, it had been set ablaze. With no supplies and no decisive victory, Napoleon was forced to retreat in the face of the impending Russian winter. The retreat, harassed by Russian forces and compounded by freezing temperatures, destroyed what was left of the Grande Armée. By the time Napoleon withdrew from Russia, fewer than 100,000 of the original 600,000 soldiers remained, and the French army was no longer the formidable force it had once been. The Russian campaign shattered Napoleon's invincibility and marked the beginning of his empire's decline. The defeat did not just diminish his military power, but also exposed the flaws in his strategy. He had underestimated the vastness of Russia and the resolve of the Russian people. Worse still, his retreat was a major humiliation, and the news of his failure reverberated across Europe, encouraging his enemies to renew their efforts against him. The Sixth Coalition and the Battle of Leipzig. In the wake of Napoleon's failure in Russia, Europe's monarchies saw their chance to finally break the French emperor's grip on the continent. The Sixth Coalition was formed in 1813, consisting of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, Spain, and Austria. These powers had long been engaged in conflict with Napoleon, but the defeat in Russia marked a significant turning point, as these nations now saw the opportunity to defeat him once and for all. The Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, was the decisive engagement of the 1813 campaign. Napoleon, once again leading an army that was smaller than that of the coalition, sought to deliver a crushing blow. However, the battle proved to be a monumental disaster for Napoleon. Over 3 days, between October 16th and October 19th, Napoleon faced an allied army of over 300,000 soldiers, while his forces numbered just over 180,000. Despite his tactical brilliance, Napoleon could not overcome the sheer numbers of the coalition forces. The Battle of Leipzig was a resounding defeat for Napoleon, and it effectively ended his dominance in Europe. After the battle, Napoleon was forced to retreat back into France, and the coalition forces pursued him, occupying key French territories. The defeat at Leipzig revealed the limitations of Napoleon's military genius. His ability to win battles through superior tactics could not compensate for his dwindling resources, declining morale, and the ever-expanding number of enemies. The invasion of France and the fall of Paris. Following the Battle of Leipzig, the Allies pushed into France itself. Napoleon, now facing the combined might of the Sixth Coalition, attempted to rally his forces to defend his empire. However, the situation was dire. The French army, exhausted from years of conflict, was no match for the fresh, well-supplied troops of the coalition. In the spring of 1814, the coalition forces entered France. Napoleon tried to stem the tide by using his usual tactics, attempting to fight a series of smaller battles to slow the advance of the Allies. However, the war had taken its toll, and France's military was now in a state of collapse. By March 1814, the Allied forces had reached Paris, and despite Napoleon's attempts to rally his forces, the French capital fell. On March 31st, Paris was occupied by the coalition forces, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne on April 6, 1814. Napoleon's abdication marked the formal end of his reign in France. He was exiled to the island of Elba, a small Mediterranean island off the coast of Italy, where he was granted the title of Emperor of Elba and given control over a small territory. The fall of Paris and Napoleon's abdication were the culmination of years of warfare, and they marked the end of the Napoleonic Empire in Europe. The 100 Days and the return to power. Napoleon's exile to Elba did not mark the end of his ambitions. The European monarchies, particularly in France, had grown unstable in the wake of his abdication. In France, the Bourbon monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII, but the new regime was deeply unpopular. The French people, weary of war and dissatisfied with the return of the old order, longed for Napoleon's return. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, saw a chance to reclaim his empire. In March 1815, after just under a year of exile, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France. The 100 Days, as this period would come to be known, saw Napoleon quickly rally a loyal following and take control of the French government. He regained his imperial title and began to prepare for war once again. However, the other European powers were not willing to allow his return to power. The Seventh Coalition, consisting of Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and other states, was quickly formed to oppose him. Napoleon's return was met with a mixture of enthusiasm and fear, but it was clear that he was once again a formidable threat. The European powers, determined to remove him from power once and for all, gathered their forces to face him. Napoleon's final military engagement, the Battle of Waterloo, would determine the fate of his reign. The Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18th, 1815, was the culmination of Napoleon's rise and fall. Napoleon faced a combined army of British, Dutch, Belgian, and Prussian forces, commanded by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian General Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Napoleon's forces were initially confident, but the coalition's forces were determined and well prepared. The battle was a brutal and intense engagement. Despite his tactical genius, Napoleon faced several disadvantages. The terrain was not favorable for his forces, and he was unable to decisively defeat the Allied forces before the arrival of the Prussian reinforcements. After a day of fierce fighting, the Allied forces with Prussian support broke through the French lines, and Napoleon was forced to retreat. The Battle of Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's military career. His army was shattered, and he was once again forced to abdicate. This time, there would be no return. Napoleon was captured by the British and exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. Exile and death. Napoleon's final exile to St. Helena was far removed from the grandeur and power he had once enjoyed. The island was isolated and harsh, and Napoleon was kept under constant surveillance by the British. He lived there in relative obscurity, writing memoirs and reflecting on his life, his empire, and his legacy. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, most likely from stomach cancer, although some theories suggest he may have been poisoned. Napoleon's death marked the definitive end of his era. Yet his impact on Europe and the world was far from over. His legal and administrative reforms, particularly the Napoleonic Code, became the foundation for legal systems in many countries around the world. His military tactics continued to influence future generations of commanders, and his rise and fall became a symbol of both the potential and the dangers of ambition. Legacy. Napoleon's legacy is complex and multifaceted. While his empire crumbled, his ideas and reforms lived on. The Napoleonic Wars transformed Europe, reshaping political boundaries and ideas about sovereignty, citizenship, and the relationship between the state and the individual. Napoleon's reign marked the end of the traditional monarchies of Europe, and his empire's collapse led to the rise of new political ideologies and systems that would define the 19th century. Napoleon's name remains synonymous with power, genius, and ambition. Though he is remembered for his military brilliance and his contributions to law and governance, his fall serves as a cautionary tale of overreach and the limits of even the greatest leaders.